It started like any other congressional oversight hearing, tense, partisan, and ripe with veiled jabs. But no one expected Barron Trump, son of former President Donald Trump and now a rising conservative firebrand, to dominate the floor. "I'm just going to say what everyone's thinking," Barron said confidently, adjusting his navy blazer as the camera zoomed in. "Representative Jasmine Crockett is simply not qualified to sit on this committee. Her record is a disaster." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Crockett, calm but visibly burning with restraint, glanced up from her tablet. She'd been here before, spoken over, underestimated, judged. But this time, something about Barron's dismissiveness hit a nerve deeper than politics. "You done?" she asked dryly, her voice low but unwavering. Barron smirked. "Unless you've got something real to show us." Jasmine looked at him, then reached slowly into her folder. She slid a small, black USB drive across the table. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to use this," she said. But since qualifications are on the table, the room shifted. "What was on that drive?" Reporters leaned in. Members of Congress exchanged curious glances. Barron didn't flinch, yet. But deep down, something about the calm in her voice, something about the precision with which she moved, began to unnerve him. The chairman paused the session briefly as Jasmine Crockett handed the USB to the tech clerk. Barron Trump folded his arms, still visibly relaxed, but the tapping of his polished shoe on the floor betrayed a flicker of nervousness. "This recording," Crockett said as the monitors lit up, "was made during a closed-door session last month. One that Barron Trump attended. He didn't know the mics were hot." The chamber fell into silence. The screen blinked, then audio played. Barron's voice rang out, crisp and unmistakable. "We'll keep her boxed in. Doesn't matter what bills she passes, just keep the headlines focused on angry, unprepared, radical. The base eats it up." Gasps exploded from every corner. A few staffers dropped their pens. On screen, his voice continued. "Crockett's smarter than most of the people in that room. She's got receipts. That's a problem." Barron's face turned from amused to ashen. The chairman looked stunned. Even some of Barron's conservative allies shifted in their chairs, visibly uncomfortable. The mask of control he wore cracked just slightly as he glanced toward his father's former aide seated in the back row. Jasmine leaned forward. Her voice was calm, steady, and sharp. "Unqualified? Or just, inconvenient?" Barron didn't speak. For the first time all morning, he had nothing to say. The silence after the recording was deafening. Barron Trump stared straight ahead, jaw tight, lips pressed into a thin line. The confidence that had animated him minutes ago had evaporated. No witty retort. No smirk. Just a young man suddenly aware that he'd said too much in the wrong room, and that it had been captured by the very woman he tried to publicly humiliate. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The room spoke for her. Even Republican committee members looked down at their notes, unwilling to meet her eyes. One aide whispered frantically into a phone in the back row. Another slowly closed their laptop, knowing this would soon explode online. Chairman Whitfield cleared his throat, trying to recover order. "Representative Crockett," he said carefully, "where did you obtain this recording?" She locked eyes with him. "It was my staff's feed. Legal. Archived. Your committee signed off on the recording procedures." He forgot the cameras were still on when he left the main chamber. Barron finally moved. He leaned toward his mic, his voice quieter now, tight, forced. This is a political ambush." Jasmine responded evenly. "No. This is accountability. And now, the entire country knows exactly why my qualifications scare you." Reporters began tweeting live from inside the chamber. Hashtag Crockett vs. Barron started trending before the hearing even adjourned. Outside the chamber, the world moved fast. Within minutes of the audio leak, clips of Barron Trump's remarks were splashed across social media. CNN broke in with a banner, Barron Trump caught on hot mic undermining colleague, calls Crockett smarter than most. Fox News hesitated, then pivoted to damage control. MSNBC ran it on loop. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Barron adjusted his collar and whispered something to his aide. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, not smug, but collected. She knew what this meant. Not just for her, but for every woman like her who'd been labeled angry instead of assertive, radical instead of reformist, unqualified instead of unstoppable. Chairman Whitfield called for a 5-minute recess. As lawmakers stood and scattered into clusters, Jasmine remained seated. Barron stood slowly and glanced her way, not defiant, not apologetic, but searching. For footing. For spin. For any kind of exit strategy. She didn't look away. A reporter near the chamber door yelled out a question, "Congresswoman Crockett, what's your response to being called smarter than most by someone trying to discredit you?" She smiled faintly. "I'd say, sometimes, the truth slips out when the mask comes off." Barron walked past her, avoiding eye contact. But the damage was done, and the headlines had already written themselves. By the time the recess ended, the landscape had already changed. On Capitol Hill, aides scrambled to reframe Barron Trump's comments. Some floated statements about context and strategic banter. Others pushed a vague narrative about deepfake editing, which was quickly debunked by the official committee recording logs. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's team stayed silent, by design. Let the audio speak. Let the public decide. And they did. Across the country, the reaction was swift. Political commentators who had once dismissed Crockett as too blunt or too progressive were suddenly praising her composure and strategic brilliance. Editorials popped up overnight. Jasmine Crockett just taught a masterclass in political jiu-jitsu. The Atlantic, when Barron Trump got burned by his own words. Washington Post, a rising star and the end of nepotistic arrogance. Chicago Tribune polls began to shift. Independents, particularly women and younger voters, leaned harder in favor of Crockett's positions. Clips of her calmly dismantling Barron's attack racked up millions of views. Even some conservative voters began questioning why someone like Barron, young, inexperienced, and handed every platform, was the one throwing around the word unqualified. Inside the hearing room, Jasmine returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. Because for her, this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. While the public applauded Jasmine Crockett, behind the scenes, Republican leadership was in damage control overdrive. Barron Trump was pulled into a private meeting that afternoon with senior GOP strategists. What began as a quiet debrief turned into a full-blown interrogation. "What were you thinking?" one advisor snapped. "You don't say that kind of stuff, even in private, especially not about someone with a mic and a memory," another barked. Barron didn't argue. He sat stone-faced, fists clenched on the table. He hadn't expected Jasmine to play it like this. He thought he could bait her, box her in with narrative and sound bites. He underestimated her, and now it was his image on the chopping block. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was in a smaller, quieter meeting with her closest aides. Her chief of staff leaned in. "We can capitalize on this, book you for Sunday shows, op-eds, endorsements. Everyone wants to talk to you." But Jasmine shook her head. "Not yet. We don't chase noise. Let them talk. Let them spin. I'll speak, when it matters." That restraint, rare in today's political media frenzy, only strengthened her standing. Voters respected it. Lawmakers noticed it. And Barron? He left the strategy meeting with one instruction: lay low. No tweets. No statements. No interviews. The less he said, the better. But whispers had already started on the Hill. Crockett might be the most dangerous voice in that room, because she doesn't just fight back. She waits, then devastates. In the days that followed, a quiet power shift began to ripple through Washington. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence became louder than any press conference. She returned to committee meetings with the same precision and fire she always had, but now, the room listened more closely. Even her usual critics hesitated before interrupting. Barron Trump, on the other hand, became a cautionary tale. Media outlets began re-evaluating his rise, not as earned, but inherited. His defenders shrank in number. Invitations to major conservative conferences were quietly rescinded. One political PAC pulled a planned campaign ad featuring him. "You went after her qualifications," a senior GOP donor said on a leaked call. "And accidentally proved she was 10 steps ahead of you." The clip of Jasmine sliding the USB across the table, slow, deliberate, and deadly, became an instant classic. It was replayed on TikTok with cinematic music. It appeared in student debates, late-night comedy sketches, and even a parody SNL cold open. But for Jasmine, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the next time someone tried to silence her with labels like unqualified, they'd have to ask themselves, what else does she have saved on a USB? The message was clear: underestimating Jasmine Crockett came with consequences. And Barron Trump? He'd learned that lesson more than once. Weeks later, as Congress reconvened for a critical vote on a bipartisan transparency bill, ironically, one Barron had once championed, he sat quietly in the back row, present but sidelined. The aura of inevitability that had once followed him was gone. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, stepped forward to speak on the House floor. No notes. No USB this time. Just her voice. "Accountability isn't about who talks the loudest," she said clearly, "it's about who brings the truth, even when it's inconvenient." Her words were measured but heavy. And as the chamber quieted, it was clear, this wasn't just about Barron anymore. It was about what kind of leadership America was ready to reward. The bill passed, with rare bipartisan support. Afterward, a junior congressman approached her with a grin. "That was one of the coldest takedowns I've ever seen. You're not just surviving here, you're rewriting the playbook." She smiled, humble but firm. "I'm just doing the job. And making sure the next woman after me doesn't have to prove she belongs in the room." As she walked out, past the rows of cameras and whispers, Barron Trump watched her go, silent, reflective, and, for the first time, perhaps, respectful. Because Crockett hadn't just flipped the narrative. She had owned it. And Washington would never look at her the same way again. What happened between Barron Trump and Jasmine Crockett didn't stay in D.C. Across college campuses, in classrooms and community halls, Crockett's stand was dissected, admired, studied. Young women, especially women of color, quoted her words. Political science students called the USB moment this generation's mic drop. Memes and GIFs flooded timelines, but behind the humor was real resonance. Meanwhile, Barron faced an identity crisis. His handlers floated a rebranding tour. A sit-down interview. Maybe a soft apology. But every suggestion sounded hollow. Because the problem wasn't the recording. It was that it revealed the truth, about how power is often protected, and how fear dresses itself up as criticism. And Jasmine? She didn't just move on, she leveled up. Within months, her name started circulating for a leadership position in her caucus. Donors took notice. High-profile endorsements rolled in quietly. And though she hadn't announced anything, whispers began to spread, Crockett 2028. She never responded to the rumors. She didn't have to. Because what began as a smear attempt by a political heir had ended as a defining moment for a movement, and for a congresswoman who never asked for permission to lead. One late evening, long after the media frenzy had calmed, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, catching up on district reports. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then picked up. "Congresswoman Crockett," a familiar voice said. It was Barron Trump. There was no bravado in his tone. No spin. Just a pause, and then a sentence no one would have expected weeks ago. You were right. Jasmine said nothing at first. Just waited. I was trying to discredit you before you got too powerful, he admitted. But I underestimated what real preparation looks like. She stayed composed. Takes more than sound bites and a last name to lead, Barron. You learned that the hard way. There was a long silence. Then, I did. And I'm still learning. He hung up without another word. Jasmine set the phone down and stared out the window at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. The call didn't vindicate her, she didn't need it to. But it confirmed what the country had already seen, the tides were shifting. The old playbook no longer worked. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just in the game. She was changing it. In the months that followed, Jasmine Crockett's influence only deepened. She was invited to keynote national conferences. Major networks asked her to host policy roundtables. Editorial boards sought her opinion before publishing. But she didn't just accept the spotlight, she redirected it, often bringing lesser-known voices with her into the conversation. At one televised town hall, a moderator asked, "Congresswoman, what would you say to young people who feel ignored by politics?" She didn't hesitate. You don't wait to be invited into the room. You walk in, pull up a chair, and if the table's too small, you build a bigger one. It went viral instantly. Meanwhile, Barron Trump remained largely out of sight. Occasionally photographed at fundraisers, but never again with the commanding presence he once carried. His name still held weight, but not the kind that silenced rooms anymore. One quiet afternoon, Jasmine passed him in a hallway on the Hill. He nodded. She nodded back. Nothing more needed to be said. He knew what the world had already accepted: the future didn't belong to those who inherited power. It belonged to those who earned it. And Jasmine Crockett had earned every step forward. Months later, the headlines had changed, and so had the narrative. What began as an attempt to humiliate Jasmine Crockett had instead propelled her to national prominence. Not because she fought back with rage, but because she wielded proof, patience, and precision. In a packed auditorium at Howard University, she delivered the closing speech of a youth political summit. The room buzzed with energy, students on their feet, phones raised, hanging on her every word. She paused, then spoke with quiet power. They tried to write my ending before my story began. But I had the receipts. I always do. Thunderous applause erupted. Back in Washington, whispers of her future grew louder: Speaker, Senate run, cabinet material. And Barron Trump? He remained in politics, still vocal, still ambitious, but now more careful. Less sharp. Had learned that legacy doesn't guarantee loyalty, and power without purpose is fragile. He would recover in time, but he would never forget the woman who taught him a lesson with a flash drive and a microphone. As Jasmine Crockett left the stage that night, a young girl in the front row yelled out, "You gave us a blueprint." Jasmine turned, smiled, and raised a hand. "No, baby. I gave you a mirror." Because in the end, she didn't just change the conversation, she became the standard.